Welcome to Whiskey Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 968 for September 4th, 2022. Coming up in a few minutes.
You hear the governor, all the politicians come out and they make a toast and they're all really happy about this economic investment. And it's been seen as just an unmitigated boon for the state. And it really wasn't until fairly recently that we began to sort of see individual cities and counties and even neighborhoods saying, hang on a minute, I don't want this here.
Janet Patton covers the bourbon beat for the Lexington Herald-Leader and recently led a series of stories on the impact of the bourbon industry in Kentucky. With this weekend marking the start of Bourbon Heritage Month, we'll take a look at what's happening in bourbon country on this week's Whiskey Cast in depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, our latest Whiskey Club of the Month winner, and...
I wouldn't say it would fulfill a childhood dream, because what child dreams of having a whiskey distillery?
The news is next on this week's Whiskey Cast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Happy Labour Day. I know it's bittersweet because it means summer's coming to an end, but autumn has its charms too. Think of all the cold evenings that will go perfectly with a glass of Redbreast.
Proud sponsor of Whiskey Cast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Gabriel Cardarella here with Dewar's Whiskey, inviting you to enjoy this episode of Whiskey Cast with a glass of Dewar's, the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in history.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. There are more distilleries in Kentucky's future, one we know about, and one that is just speculation as of this weekend. That's because Denny Potter and Jane Bowie have not disclosed their future plans yet. They stepped down Friday at Maker's Mark, where Denny was general manager and master distiller, and Jane headed up blending and maturation. In an email this week to Maker's Mark ambassadors, managing director Rob Samuels said the two have some entrepreneurial plans of their own. Jane told me in an email that she and Denny wanted to focus this week on wrapping up things at Maker's Mark, and will discuss their future plans soon. The logical bet is that they're working on a distillery project of their own, but once again, that is just speculation. Meanwhile, when we talked with Blue Run Spirits co-founder Mike Montgomery earlier this year, plans for a distillery of their own were still a dream. That changed with this week's announcement that Blue Run plans to build a $51 million distillery in Georgetown, Kentucky. The announcement came from Governor Andy Beshear's office, which touted the state's economic development funding for the project. Montgomery told me this week that they sped up their plans after looking at the whiskey supply forecasts for the future.
The sourced barrel market has tightened considerably. It's gotten much more expensive. The contract distillation opportunities aren't as plentiful as they used to be. And so the big issue that we have at this point in time is trying to figure out how we guarantee supply on into the future at reasonable prices that allow us to grow at the level that we need to.
Tell me about the timeline.
Well, I think in an ideal world, we would attempt to break ground next year and be open at some point in time in 2025.
What does this mean to you to actually have your own distillery?
I think it's really exciting. It's I wouldn't say it would fulfill a childhood dream, because what child dreams of having a whiskey distillery? But the idea is really exciting for all of us. It's it would provide us a little bit more freedom, and that's not to say we haven't had great relationships at places like Castle and Key, and especially at Bardstown Bourbon Company, where we consider the folks at BBC family. It's just the idea of designing a facility that fits who we are as a brand and who we believe our consumers are, that has I guess, levels of sustainability that haven't been seen before in this industry. That's exciting. That's exciting to all of us. It's really a blank slate that would give us the opportunity to carry through the brand vision into an actual facility.
Now, why Georgetown?
Georgetown. Well, Georgetown it's an amazing, magical place. I'm sure you've spent time there and or at least been through there. And there's a little bit of Mayberry to it. There's a little bit of growing and thriving metropolis to it. It's kind of the best of both worlds. You've got the Toyota plant there that employs upwards of 10,000 people. It's got visitors from all around the world coming into town. Country Boy Brewery is there, and we've seen the amount of business that Country Boy has done in a couple of short years. Georgetown is also home to my co-founder, Jesse McKnight. I think we may have talked about that when we were on a number of months ago. And Jesse grew up in Georgetown. He went he grew up in the shadow of Georgetown College. He grew up playing in what he called the Blue Run, which was aptly named after the Reverend. Let's see if I can get that word out. The Reverend Elijah Craig's Blue Run Baptist Church. And so for us, Georgetown has always been the headquarters. And it's been the place that we have been most interested in locating.
The change in plans happened so quickly that they're still putting together the entire funding package for the distillery. Over at Buffalo Trace, they're working on the $1.2 billion expansion that was announced back in 2018. The latest step in the project is the completion of construction work on a second still house. There is still some final electrical work to be done before commissioning tests can begin in the next few weeks. The new still house will help Buffalo Trace reach its goal of doubling its annual production over time. Now, the only expansion at Wild Turkey is a new line of Russell's Reserve bourbons. The Single Rickhouse series will be an annual collection of barrels picked from a single rickhouse. In this year's case, it's the old Camp Nelson Sea Warehouse that was decommissioned last year and has since been torn down. Master distiller Eddie Russell selected 72 of the final Sea Warehouse barrels for the expression. It'll be available early next month at select U.S. retailers and at the Wild Turkey Distillery with a recommended retail price of $249.99 each. Tamdhu Distillery is out with a new single cask bottling to mark the distillery's 125th anniversary. The cask was selected by the distillery's Dedication Society and was filled in November of 2003. Only 640 bottles will be available through the distillery's online shop at £349 each. Talisker has released a new travel retail exclusive bottling. Talisker Surge is finished in ex-bourbon barrels and will make its debut at European and UK airports this month. It hits Asia-Pacific airports in October, Australia in December. Pricing will be £85 in the UK, €95 in Europe. Highland Park is out with the third edition of its cask strength single malt. Release number 3 uses a higher proportion of peated Orkney malt than the first two releases and is matured in a combination of first-fill sherry-seasoned American and European oak casks, with a few refill casks added in for good measure. It's available now in the UK for £65 a bottle and should be available in the US soon. No word yet on US pricing. Australia's Manly Spirits has released its flagship Coastal Stone expression. Nor'easter is now available online and at the distillery in Sydney. It's matured in a combination of charred red wine, American oak, and French oak casks, and sells for $99 Australian at the distillery. In other news, the famous Grouse has named a new master blender and turned to Australia to bring expat Craig Johnstone back home to Scotland. He's been the whiskey blender and wood manager at Tasmania's Lark Distilling Company and has a total of 19 years of experience in the whiskey industry. Finally, while space nerds like me are waiting for NASA to launch its Artemis 1 lunar mission, whiskey nerds like us will have to wait a few years to see what happens with an experiment that Glenlivet took part in. Chivas Brothers donated barley seeds for a special project with the University of Guelph in Canada. The seeds were sent to the International Space Station to test the impact of zero gravity and cosmic radiation over time. Now that the seeds have been returned to Earth, they'll be planted at the Glenlivet and eventually malted and distilled into what the distillery is calling a space-side whiskey. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com and on our social media timelines. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from Whiskey Cast.
A quick program note for you now. Mark your calendar for Friday, September 16th. That's when our Happy Hour live webcast return for a new season. My guest will be Dewar's Master Blender Stephanie McLeod, and we'll start at 5 p.m. New York time on the Whiskey Cast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. Time now for the Whiskey Cast calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. First off, we have an update. Whiskey Live Toronto will not take place later this month as originally scheduled because of venue issues. Organizers are hoping to reschedule it for January, but have not yet confirmed a date. Meanwhile, the Sydney Whiskey Fair is this coming Friday and Saturday in Sydney, Australia. The National Whiskey Festival is Saturday in Aberdeen, Scotland. The Twisted Tale in Philadelphia hosts its annual Whiskey Bonanza Night on the 15th, and the Wisconsin Whiskey Fest is in Milwaukee on the 17th. The Whiskey Guild's annual Whiskey on the Water cruise returns to New York City on the 22nd. That same night is the Orange Coast Whiskey Festival in Irvine, California. Michigan Distilled is on the 23rd in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And 40 Creek Distillery's annual Whiskey Weekend returns on September 24th and 25th. If you're organizing a whiskey event, please let us know about it. We'll be glad to add it to our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. It's brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the new buyvirginiarye.com site for more details, and please drink responsibly.
Dewar's Master Blender Stephanie McLeod's innate curiosity, combined with her passion for whiskey maturation, cask finishing, and blending, has created some truly incredible expressions for Dewar's Scotch whiskey. It's also earned her 4 consecutive Master Blender of the Year titles at the International Whiskey Competition, making her the first person to achieve such an accolade. Her innovative spirit is the inspiration behind the ultra-premium Dewar's Double 32 Year, the highest-rated blended Scotch whiskey in the world with a score of 94.4. So whether you consider yourself a whiskey connoisseur or just want to find an exciting new whiskey experience, consider one of Stephanie's other masterful expressions, including Dewar's 15-year, Double 21-year, or Dewar's 8-year Mizunara cask finish, and discover just how rewarding curiosity can be. Enjoy responsibly.
Whiskey Cast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. September is Bourbon Heritage Month, and bourbon is becoming more and more of an economic engine in Kentucky. The Lexington Herald-Leader recently cataloged 95 different distillery projects since 2015, worth an estimated $3.2 billion. Not all of those projects have been built, but they were approved for state economic development incentives. Janet Patton covers the bourbon beat for the Herald-Leader and recently led the paper's special series of stories looking at the impact bourbon has had on Kentucky. So how would you describe the state of the bourbon industry in 2022 as we start Bourbon Heritage Month?
I think it's really, really healthy, really strong, just based on a lot of the things that we've seen in recent days. Just this week, I think we had Buffalo Trace announcing that their production is doubling, that they've made like a $1.2 billion expansion that they're in the middle of. And that's going to double the amount of their whiskeys. And Brown-Forman announced their quarterly earnings. So sales had gone up 11% and topped $1 billion for the quarter. That seems pretty strong. I think, it's hard to see any remaining downside from either the pandemic or the tariffs right now.
And on top of that, you have the Beam Suntory $400 million going into the Booker No distillery.
Right.
You also have the Blue Run Spirits project announced this week at $50 million.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money going into this state.
And they're not done. I mean, that's just what, has kind of bubbled up. I know there's going to be at least one other big announcement coming from IJW, which as far as I know, I don't think they even released any whiskey yet. I don't think they even have anything on the market. And they're talking about building a $200 million new distillery in Shelbyville. And there's a couple of other little small things that are kind of incremental that are kind of filtering out, but it's kind of stunning. I think, I've written about the Angel's Envy and the major expansions that Buffalo Trace wants to do. When you look at the totality of it, it's just incredible. I think more than 100 projects just in since 2015 have gone through the Economic Development Finance Authority. So that's not everything. Not everybody does that process. It's almost too much just to keep track of.
And it comes with a certain number of growing pains, doesn't it, as you found in your research for that series?
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it, is growing pains, because, you hear the governor, all the politicians come out and they make a toast and they're all really happy about this economic investment. And it's been seen as just an unmitigated boon for the state. And it really wasn't until fairly recently that we began to sort of see individual cities and counties and even, neighborhoods saying, hang on a minute, I don't want this here. And that's kind of where my series started, was with the people in Franklin County and then Anderson County pushing back on Buffalo Trace, saying, no, we don't want you to put 23 warehouses in this land next to us, or in Henry County, which is where Angel's Envy wants to build a really, what sounds like a really nice, lovely distillery campus. I mean, their distillery, I don't think is going to be there. They've already built a distillery in Henry County. This is just going to be warehouses and a lot of tourism stuff. And it's important to put that one in context, because Henry County is where Wendell Berry lives. And if you know anything about Wendell Berry, the Kentucky writer, he's been an environmental activist. He's written about, agrarian philosophy. So the idea that what he calls a major industrial complex would be situated behind his home place farm where he grew up is just so startling and striking that he's been speaking out publicly against it.
He wrote a commentary for the Herald-Leader, too, right?
He did, a very powerful piece. I was really stunned that he was willing. He's not someone who speaks publicly very often, but he wrote that. He agreed even to do a video and an interview, and has spoken to the Planning Commission in Henry County against it. It did get approval by the Planning Commission, so they're still fighting it at the county level. And what they all have in common is they're all worried about whiskey fungus. That's the main thing. They're worried about whiskey fungus, what it will do to their homes, their crops, their health, to have these warehouses situated, very close to them, off-gassing ethanol fumes, what we call the angel's share. And, it does make stuff turn black. And they don't really want that. In some cases, I talked to a farmer who has high tunnel greenhouses. He grows, gourmet tomatoes and crops, and he sells them in Louisville. And he uses these high tunnels to grow tomatoes when it's, too cold to grow tomatoes in the field. So these are expensive products that he's selling, organic, high-end produce. And he's consumed with the worry that this fungus will turn his plastic tunnels black. And there goes his whole business model.
And let's explain what this fungus is. It's Boudonia, and I'm forgetting the second name in Latin for it, but it feeds on alcohol vapors in the air, right?
Yeah, as the industry likes to point out, it's naturally occurring. Yes, it is naturally occurring in that it's so is bubonic plague, right? It lives in the world, and then when there's ethanol fumes, it comes to life and it starts colonizing. And so if you've been to a distillery, you've seen it. You've seen the black, you see it here in Kentucky, you see it in Scotland, you see the black walls, the black trees. Any place basically within about a mile can start turning black. And it's just this fungus. So people who live near these things, whether it's in Jefferson County in Louisville, has had this problem for years. And so people there are used to the idea that they have to, deal with this, but it's everywhere. It's in Anderson County and Lawrenceburg. And so they power spray their homes to clean it off once, twice a year. And they're kind of tired of it. They don't really like doing it. And some people that I talked to just had given up and painted trim black just so they wouldn't have to see it anymore. So they're worried about property values from that. And the counties also sort of expressed some concern about some of the other environmental issues like fires. We've seen fires. We've seen warehouses collapse. We've seen fish kills. And traffic, there's always going to be trucks bringing barrels to distilleries, taking barrels, from the distillery to the warehouses, taking them back to be dumped. So I think as Kentucky grows in population, which is undoubtedly going to happen because we're getting all of these other big industrial projects like battery plants for electric cars. And as the bourbon industry grows, these frictions are just going to increase. More people will be living where they want to put up whiskey warehouses, and this is only going to come up again and again. And the lawsuits have already been filed over the last 10 years or so on this, but they've never really been resolved, have they? It's funny that you mentioned that. I talked to the lawyer just recently, and so I'm actually working on a follow-up about the lawsuits and the solution that he says exists, could work here. The industry doesn't want it, doesn't want to recognize it. So I don't think this battle is over at all. Are we getting to the point where there's a problem for the state of Kentucky with too much bourbon? That's a good question. I feel like for people who live in the counties, the one thing that I heard, and it is concentrated. I should say that it's not the whole state. Right now, it's concentrated in about 24 counties that have any warehouses at all, any significant bourbon presence at all. And there's really only 5 or 6 that have a lot. And what I heard consistently from the counties, the executives in the counties and people who live there, is that this is tied up in their minds with the bourbon barrel tax. It's worth it to have this problem, people told me, as long as we get the money from the barrel tax. And ironically, this is something that's actually being debated right now in Frankfurt. They're having a Bourbon Barrel Task Force meeting. They've been having them all summer to talk about what they can do about this tax, which, the industry wants to get rid of. Kentucky is apparently the only state that taxes aging spirits in the warehouse. And so the Kentucky Distillers Association say, we need to stop this, because if we don't, new distillers will go elsewhere. New facilities will be built in states that don't have to pay that tax. The counties here say, we need that revenue. That's part of the bargain. And some of them have structured their whole county budget around that in ways that they just can't, you can't just take it away. As the retiring head of Nelson County, where Bardstown is located, told me, did you ever take an ice cream cone away from a baby? It's like that. If you take this money away, it's not going to be pretty, he says.
And we should explain that the KDA was able to push through legislation a few years ago that allowed the distilleries to take a credit for the barrel tax payments they make to local governments against their corporate income taxes to the state. But the problem is the barrel tax revenue has vastly exceeded the corporate income tax payments, so now the distillers can't use all those credits that they've been getting.
Yeah, you've summed it up. The barrel tax payments have been increasing. The KDA said that last year they paid about $33 million in barrel taxes to the state and to the counties. And in the meantime, the state of Kentucky changed its corporate tax structure so that businesses like multi-state businesses like the distillers pay far less. So as their corporate income taxes dropped and their barrel taxes went up, they had credits you couldn't use. They couldn't offset it because they already weren't paying the tax on their income, their corporate income taxes.
Is there a resolution for this that keeps the counties whole but lets the distillers feel like they've won as well?
That's what they're trying to work out in Frankfurt, and I feel certain they will come up with some legislation. Chad Mccoy, who is retiring, is a co-chair with Senate President Bob Stivers. So I would be very surprised if they don't come up with some kind of a bill. McCoy said today he hasn't pre-filed a bill, that he hasn't written it yet. He says everyone needs to get creative, but he also said that he realizes how important it is to keep the counties whole, that the local taxes that go to pay for the firefighters that are going to fight any fires if they come out of these, if another warehouse gets struck by lightning, like has happened in Woodford County, the Jim Beam warehouse a few years ago, those firefighters were paid for in part by bourbon barrel taxes. So those have to, those have to be whole. They can't take that away. I'm sure they will come up with some kind of legislation. What that means for the rest of Kentucky taxpayers, I don't know. I mean, is it one solution that was talked about at one of these meetings was the idea of just making the taxes refundable. So what could end up happening is, in a sense, they come up with some way for the distillers to pay the taxes, and then they're refunded the taxes, but somehow the state pays the local portion, which would mean that taxpayers in general would be on the hook for this. I'm not sure that's a solution that can get through the state legislature. So I'll be very interested to see what they come up with too. They will need to get creative.
I can't wait to see the thought of taxpayers in dry counties helping to pay for rebates to the bourbon industry. That's going to be a non-starter, I suspect.
I think that, they will not frame it that way. But when you're talking about distillers getting all of their money back and yet counties being made whole, it's hard to see where else that money comes from except from other taxpayers. So I'll be very interested to see what creative solutions they come up with.
When you did your research on the number of projects, and I think it was 95 at least, totaling $3.2 billion, and that doesn't count the visitor center expansions.
Oh yeah,
alone.
There were just so many. I mean, tourism has exploded here. If you look at Heaven Hill had a mammoth visitor center project. Virtually every distillery that had one built a new one in the last 5 to 10 years. And a few of those have actually had to be rebuilt again because there's just so much more and more. Buffalo Trace had one, opened one, enlarged it. It just keeps kind of growing and growing. It's incredible. And
that's creating its own structural infrastructure issues as well with traffic. I mean, that road out to Maker's Mark in Loretto is 2 lanes at best most of the way, and it gets pretty crowded going out there at times. But a lot of these distilleries are out in areas that are not exactly on the beaten path.
That's true. And I think a big part of the money at Maker's Mark was to reroute the traffic. They, reconfigured the parking and reconfigured how the trucks, the non-tourists, the actual business of the distillery got in and out so that those 2 paths weren't crossing. You want to keep the pretty so the visitors can see the pretty little stone bridge and the stream and the barns and, the fields, and it looks bucolic. You don't want that messed up with, great big 18-wheelers coming in there, hauling in and out whiskey and grain and barrels. No. That's not so pretty. Let's move that somewhere else.
It's sort of like the Napafication of Kentucky. I know that they've used Napa Valley as a model. Is it getting too upscale almost for the average Kentuckian?
I've heard people talk about that, mention that, especially you had wanted to talk about the Bourbon Festival, I think. And I've heard people sort of express that, the Bourbon Festival, Kentucky Bourbon Festival, which is coming up in September, used to be sort of a local thing, used to be something for hardcore fans and locals to sort of celebrate their hometown glory. And it's really had to change. I mean, it had to. It has so many people now that they've had to go to almost, I think everything is ticketed now. It's completely sold out. They announced that this week. So if you don't have a ticket, I don't think there's really any point in even going to Bardstown. There's nothing to see that's just free and open. Can you even go to the barrel races now? Is that still open or is that ticketed?
I believe they kept the barrel races open.
That's
because
maybe
of
the only
the community
thing.
aspect, but that's it. They got rid of the Midway. They got rid of the concerts.
Yeah.
They got rid of the food trucks and everything, I think, for the most part. And the county fair atmosphere.
Yeah.
That
it
made
reminds
the
me
Bourbon
a
Festival
lot.
unique.
It reminds me a lot, if you've ever been to the Kentucky Derby, of kind of how that's had to change over the years. It used to be that the Derby was a local thing. And then it was, okay, well, Friday, Oaks Day is really for locals. And Saturday, the Derby is when internationals fly in. And then, okay, Thursday before Derby, that's our day. And Oaks and Derby are for the high rollers who come in. Okay, now we're not even sure about Derby anymore. So it's just, as events and industries change to pursue the upscale revenue, the fans at the middle and lower ends get squeezed out. There's no doubt about it.
And the folks who just wanted to go to, say, the car show, things like that, things that made the Bourbon Festival unique.
Right. I mean, it's just, I used to love to go and see like the cooking with bourbon thing, just to see people talk about that. And it's just, everything now is an experience. I mean, it's not just, and I don't want to blame the Kentucky Bourbon Festival. They kind of built this monster with tourism. I mean, the Bourbon Festival didn't, but the distilleries kind of built this monster with tourism, and now it's kind of circling back on itself. And even the KDA, the Kentucky Distillers Association, which had created their sort of fantasy camp, they put that on hold because their demand is just huge, and they have to come up with these unique and special experiences that people will pay so much money for. I get it. I do. I understand. But, it's kind of the same thing that has happened with the individual bottles. I mean, you used to be able to get a lot of just regular old pretty good bourbon. And now that everybody knows it's impossible now.
I mean, you can't even find bottles that we used to be able to get 10 years ago without paying exorbitant markups over retail. And I won't even talk about Van Winkle.
Yeah, let's not even. There was, a line this week. This is a very special bottle. It's not even a normal bottle. Outside of Four Roses, they were releasing a very special release for flood relief, and people started lining up the night before. And this was, $200 a bottle, and seriously, it was meant just for flood relief. But what I was seeing on social media was that, people were lining up the night before, waiting in line to get these things, and then flip them almost immediately.
We should talk about flood relief because that's one area where the industry did do a lot of good. In terms of raising close to $1.5 million at least between the various auctions so far, not to mention the corporate donations.
That's right. And Four Roses was incredibly generous, and they raised a ton of money, and they had, I think the most expensive single item, which was an experience choosing a barrel with Brent Elliott. And I think that one went for, was it
157, and they did two of them.
Yeah, that's right. Because at the last minute, they said, you know what? We'll go ahead and match it to the underbidder. So I thought, man, that's really very classy. And then they did the $200 bottle release, and they gave some money as well. So the industry has been very generous. They did this one, and then they did one in the winter for the tornado relief, which raised, I think, almost $3.5 million. So overall, their effort, and they trucked water out there when people out in Eastern Kentucky had literally no water for days, for weeks. So yes, that deserves credit.
We should go through really the Hall of Fame class for this year for the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. You mentioned Chad Mccoy, the retiring state representative. He's in there along with John Yarmouth, the congressman who led the Bourbon Caucus, which I will admit I joked with Eric Gregory violated their traditional limit of one politician per class.
But they fudged because they say, well, we didn't get to have one during COVID. So we lost 2 years to COVID, so we can have two.
Well, they said because they were both retiring, it made sense.
Sure. Yes, Chad McCoy of Bardstown, the late Stephen Francis Thompson, founder of Kentucky Artisan Distillery, is getting the Lifetime Achievement Award. And he was a former president of Brown Forman Distillers. Julian Van Winkle, you mentioned, and Andrea Wilson from Michter's, and Kava Zamanian of Rabbit Hole, which is kind of interesting to me. That one, Rabbit Hole, is kind of relatively young, compared to the others, but doing so well in Louisville.
And I think he was nominated by the craft distillers because the craft folks got to have their own nomination for the first time this year.
Oh, is that right? That's really nice. That's really nice. And I'm so glad they're doing that because uh, they need a lane of their own. They need a lane to honor people who are that, we make it sound like it's so easy to go out and start your own bourbon brand. And in some ways it is. It certainly is if you've got a lot of money. But it's hard to do it the right way, and it's hard to do it if you're just sort of coming into it cold. If you didn't start at another distillery, like if you don't have a background in this. I mean, like we haven't talked about the two people who are starting their own new distillery, and I feel like I don't know what they're doing. I don't know if it'll be craft. I don't know if it'll be big, but they're going to have it a lot easier than somebody who just, decides, hey, I'm going to wake up this morning and start a bourbon brand.
Well, Denny Potter and Jane Bowie of Maker's Mark fame, they're not going to have any trouble raising money for a distillery,
no.
I would think. But then again, I'm thinking about that, and I'm going, wait a second, Jim Rutledge has not been able to raise the money he needs to build the distillery that he wants to build.
Yeah.
And he's a Hall of Fame distiller with an impeccable track record, and he's not been able to raise that kind of money.
Well, but he is getting work. He's working with the Blue Run folks, and I guess with Blue Run, which I guess has been working out of Bardstown Bourbon Company for now, distilling there. I think I haven't talked to Jane and to Denny about this. We exchanged a couple of messages. I feel like they probably wouldn't have taken this step unless they have some pretty solid plans. And that must include some kind of financing. So I don't think it'll be very long before we hear more about what their plans are.
I got the same messages from them that you did, I suspect.
Yeah.
Have you heard any rumors about what they might be up to?
I have not, which kind of surprises me because this is a pretty gossipy business. Have you heard anything?
I have not heard anything.
Yeah, I was really surprised when, I'm a Maker's Mark ambassador on that list. And so when the message came out from Rob Samuels, I was like, what? Because
yeah, you and me both. I'm going, what the hell?
I mean, Jane has been I'm not trying to say to diss Denny and anything, but Jane has been kind of the one who's done all of these tastings over the last few years via Zoom. She's really, kind of been in the trenches, and I feel like losing her talent is going to be difficult to replace at Makers. I hope that. Go ahead.
And this was Denny's second stint at Makers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not unheard of. Like you said, it's not unheard of for distillers to kind of bed hop, but I was surprised. I was very surprised to see that. I don't know. I don't know what they're doing. I haven't heard anything. Go ahead.
But when you have folks like Denny and Jane and Jackie Zykan going off to start her own brand.
Oh, yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
There's a lot of folks in this industry with a lot of entrepreneurial desire and a lot of interest in starting their own brands. But I'm wondering at what point do we reach peak bourbon saturation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm sure that there are people at all of the major companies trying to sort of parse that. And, what you always hear from the big ones, the Brown Formans, the Beams, what they always told me is that they still see a really long runway. They're looking overseas, they're looking at Europe, they're looking at Asia, and they're saying, we think of us as being just flush with bourbon, but we're not even the biggest whiskey drinking country in the world. I think that's India, right? Isn't India the biggest by consumption? And so we don't even have a toehold in that market yet. Wait till they taste bourbon. They'll love it. They look at China, which they had kind of started to make a few inroads in, and then got kind of squoze back out. they don't think they're anywhere close to maxed out on the overseas market. I will say that when I go into the liquor store and I look at the shelves, and it starts to feel a little overwhelming to me. It starts to feel like wine, like you compared it to Napa with tourism. But when I just see, label after label, brand after brand, some of whom I've never heard of before, don't know anything about, it can be really hard. I don't really know why some brands take off and others don't. It's a mystery to me. Like Blue Run apparently has really good whiskey, but it seems to have a really outsized fan base for the number of people who could have possibly actually tasted it. Does it seem like that to you?
Yeah, because it's same with folks like Redwood Empire out in California and some of these other small distilleries that have gotten word-of-mouth reputations that far exceed their distribution.
Yeah, like Kentucky Owl's another one that people are just, bonkers for. Have you actually tasted it? Because, frankly, I never have I've never seen a bottle in the wild. I've never seen one. Oh, well, good for you. It's just the number of people who could actually have had a glass of it to know versus the people who retweet it or click on my stories, it's disproportionate. And I don't know what makes one brand go viral and another one not. I mean, perhaps it's for all the right reasons. Perhaps it's because you have all the right people behind it. You have a Jim Rutledge involved. You have someone who knows what they're doing, who's making good selections. Marianne Barnes is another one. Eves now, I guess. Marianne Eves is another one who's, left Brown-Forman, went to Castle and Keys, now out on her own. And she's got a following, and I like her quite a bit. And I think she's capable of producing some really, really strong whiskeys. So, maybe you've got somebody like that in there helping you, but it's not always apparent to me what makes it go crazy.
I think it's just it just comes down to luck.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think some of it is just pretty bottles and, good, I don't know, good handling.
So what have you tasted lately that impressed you?
Well, I did like the Four Roses that they did, the barrel select thing that they did recently. I thought that was quite tasty. I like that a lot. But I've never really had a Four Roses that I thought was bad, that I thought, oh, this one misses. No, I mean, every year it's up there. And this is one that, again, I have another one that 15 stars. They sent me a sample and I thought, okay, I don't know anything about this. I'm just going to crack it open. And I thought, wow, this is actually kind of interesting. I really liked it. I will be interested to see what they have when they're actually, making their own, when they actually have something they've contract distilled. And I think they are another one I think that's working with Bardstown Bourbon. So I'll be interested to see where that goes. What about you?
I have not tried 15 stars, and I need to get a sample of that one.
I didn't have high expectations because I maybe sometimes that's the thing. If you go into it not really thinking, oh, this is going to knock my socks off. Okay, that kind of impressed me a little bit. So, let's see what else. That Green River bourbon. That was good. And I think that one's pretty readily available, isn't it? I mean, and it's not exorbitantly priced, so I have high hopes for that. Although I think didn't they just have a big change or two?
Yeah, they were sold to Bardstown Bourbon.
That's
and
right.
Jacob Call left to start something new, so he's another one we have to keep an eye on.
That's right.
You almost need a scorecard to keep track of where everybody's moving these days.
It would help.
You can read Janet Patton's reporting in the Lexington Herald-Leader and online at Kentucky.com. That's Whiskey Cast in Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's begin with this year's final release of Larceny Barrel Proof Wheated Bourbon from Heaven Hill. Batch C922 is bottled at 63.3% ABV. The nose has notes of dried flowers, honey, caramel, and hints of old leather and apples. The taste is mouth-coating and peppery with touches of cinnamon, red apples, honey, vanilla, and caramel. Adding some water brings out dried fruits and a hint of chocolate on the nose, while tempering the spices on the palate somewhat and adding touches of peaches and dark chocolate. The finish is long and spicy with a nice underlying sweetness, and I'm scoring the Larceny Barrel Proof Batch C922 a 92. What happens when you blend two bourbons, a rye, and a single malt together? You get the new Borrowed Page American whiskey. It's the debut release for American Mash and Grain and takes Watershed Bourbon from Ohio, the Lee Sinclair Bourbon from Spirits of French Lick in Indiana, Wiggles Monongahela Rye, and some mesquite smoked single malt from Arizona's Whiskey Del Bac and puts them all together. Borrowed Page is bottled at 58.4% ABV. The nose has touches of baked apples, linseed oil, a hint of mesquite, grilled peaches, a touch of tobacco, honey, and vanilla. The taste has good spicy notes of black pepper and cinnamon balanced by baked apples, peaches, and honey. The finish, long and spicy with a hint of fruity character. I'm scoring Borrowed Page American Whiskey a 91. And sticking with the blending theme, the latest release from Barrel Craft Spirits has a unique pedigree. Vantage is a blend of bourbons from Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee, finished in a combination of toasted American oak, French oak, and Japanese Mizunara oak casks. It's bottled at 57.2% ABV. The nose has touches of honey, caramel, wood spices, cocoa powder, and a hint of pine needles. The taste has notes of pine sap, clove, cinnamon, and white pepper spices. It's thick and very oily with touches of cocoa powder and dried fruits. The finish is long with lingering spices and dried fruits, and I'm scoring Barrel's Vantage a 90. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, a 100-time award-winning Maryland-style rye. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature double oak, cask strength, and reserve rye whiskeys, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails at a retailer near you. Just visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. Two homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list, but the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of Whiskey Cast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Time to announce another Whiskey Club of the Month winner, and we have some history with this month's winning club. Back in early 2021, Chris Drake emailed to nominate his brand new club, the Whiskey Rebellion Club. But he didn't have any members yet, so I told him to keep us posted as his club grew. Heard from him a couple of weeks ago, and it's now a full-fledged club. Here's what Chris wrote. We are a group of 20 whiskey enthusiasts from Cleveland, Ohio. Our club is for those who are new or far along on their whiskey journey. Our members range from beginners to experts who all love to learn more about this wonderful spirit, its history, and also want to taste and try new things. We meet once a month to taste a flight of 5 whiskeys, with each meeting being a specific style. So far, we've sampled close to 100 different whiskeys in our short amount of time. And it's a great club because we have members who really adore Islay Scotch to those that love rye, and some like myself that really love it all. We do have a Facebook page and are always welcoming new members. Cheers, Mark. Congratulations, Chris. We'll be sending you 24 Whiskey Cast Glencairn glasses to use at your club's tastings. Now, if you're in a whiskey club and would like to nominate your club, do like Chris did and use the contact form at whiskycast.com. Tell us a bit about your club, and if you have a website, Facebook page, or other social media presence, we'll be glad to add a link on the Whiskey Clubs page at whiskycast.com. Once again, congratulations to the Whiskey Rebellion Club of Cleveland, Ohio, and thanks to Glencairn Crystal for helping us honor whiskey clubs around the world. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Scarabaeus Islay Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Got this email the other day from longtime listener Ken Goldenberg in Orange County, California. Mark, I have an interesting question for you. Today I saw a vodka that had on the label certified gluten-free, and it got me to thinking, is that something a person with a gluten intolerance would even have to worry about, or is this just marketing hype that is so prevalent today? I know vodka can be made with just about any type of grain or starch, but I wondered about a whiskey made with wheat. My assumption would be during the distillation process, gluten would not be a factor, since you are never ingesting the actual mash, just the vapors that are produced and then condensed back into a liquid. Now, I do understand that people that are highly allergic to peanuts can have a reaction just by smelling them, but they're inhaling microscopic particles directly coming off the actual nut. Whereas with the spirit, the final product is many steps away from any wheat that might have been used. I personally have no problem with gluten, but I would like to know the answer to this and think it could be valuable knowledge for those with this issue. Thanks, Mark, and as always, I enjoyed listening to you for all these years. Cheers, Ken Goldenberg. Thanks, Ken. It's good to hear from you. And we have discussed this before, but it's been a couple of years and always worth taking another look. Ken, your assumption is correct. Gluten does not evaporate during the distilling process and is not carried over into the final spirit. Still, just to be safe, it's probably best for those who have had bad reactions to gluten to steer clear of wheat whiskeys just in case. Keep in mind that I'm not a doctor or a distiller, but this answer is based on my talks with distillers over the years about issues with gluten. If you have a question, suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, just look for me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Scarabaeus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that celebrates all of Islay's natural gifts in one bottle. Only those who seek shall find Scarabaeus. Start your search at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Whiskey trails have become popular, with the Tennessee Whiskey Trail recording 4 million visitors in 1 year before the pandemic, and the Kentucky Bourbon Trail routinely topping 1 million visitors. But what is the most remote whiskey trail and probably the hardest to complete? I got a flyer this week for what's billed as, quote, the most difficult whiskey trail in the world, spanning Alaska and the Yukon in Canada. There are 14 distilleries on the trail, ranging from Uncharted Alaska Distillery in Ketchikan and Yukon Spirits in Whitehorse, all the way north to Fairbanks and its 3 distilleries. Almost all of the distilleries on the trail are accessible by road, but at least 2 require you to use a ferry or plane to reach the islands where they're located. And you'll need not just the trail's passport, but a real passport, since completing the trail would require crossing the U.S.-Canada border at least twice. What's the prize for getting to all 14 distilleries? It's not a T-shirt. Completing the trail gets you a ceremonial belt buckle. I'll give you an idea of just how hard it might be to complete this trail. I lived in Alaska for 7 years, working in local TV news in Anchorage, and crisscrossed the state over that time, but never made it to 4 of the towns on the trail. Of course, that was before any of the distilleries existed. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of all of our past episodes all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com.
Well, folks, we're nearing the end of another great episode of Whiskey Cast, which means you're probably craving some whiskey. Head on over to Dewar's.com or your local retailer to discover what makes Dewar's the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in the world.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
You know, there comes a stage in life when you only really see your friends at weddings, reunions, and fantasy football draft night. Make sure you bring along a suitable whiskey for the occasion. Huh?
Proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskeyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2022, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.